weekly show that guides you through the crisis in the media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how you doing?
I'm going very well, Oz. What do I have to report? It's been actually an incredibly social time up here in the Tweed. We had a visitor, which doesn't happen often. My parents and I hosted an old friend of my dad's for lunch. The former editor of the Sun Herald and Sydney Morning Herald, this guy David Hickey, back in the 90s. I just thought you might appreciate this, that I sort of didn't realize this, that at a point in the early 90s, those papers were in receivership. So they weren't owned by anybody.
Right.
And this old newspaper man, David Hickey, was like, they were the best 2 years I've ever had in journalism. We had no owner. No one gave notes. I just dealt with the receiver. They didn't ask me any questions about editorial. And look, I won't reveal confidences, but the number of expense rorts they managed to get through on this receiver as a newsroom sound incredible. I mean, the days when newspapers were making so much money, you could not have an owner and still rort expenses and print whatever you wanted. What
the day
a time.
The era that newspapers were making so much money, you could literally be in receivership and still have so much money and no one cares. Like we have media companies that are posting on paper profits and are valued at billions and billions of dollars, and there still seems to be no money in journalism. You know, ABC gets $1.5 billion taxpayer guaranteed a year, and there still seems to be no money there to do so. What's going on?
No one's like smuggling French wine on the company card or jetting off for holidays.
Hang on, I thought you weren't supposed to revell confidences.
Sorry. Anyway, it made me very sad that I didn't, wasn't in the trade in those years.
Well, look, speaking of money, we obviously are not quite there yet, but we're on an exciting trajectory thanks to all of the wonderful hundreds of people who've subscribed to our newsletter. And Scott, last week, you had a really interesting breakdown on the ABC's new social media policies. It's basically the rules that determine what ABC journalists and staff can say. Why don't you talk a little bit about that for our listeners who maybe didn't get a chance to read it?
Yeah. This hadn't happened when we recorded last week, but basically the ABC came down with these new public comment guidelines that all staff need to follow. They replace something called the ABC social media guidelines, and those were kind of sensationally dumped straight after the Latouche findings came down. Hilariously, the ABC say that dumping the social media policy had nothing to do with the findings. Pure coincidence, Oz, that they dumped it just 3 hours after the judge.
Crazy coincidental timing, yeah.
Crazy, right? The judge found that ABC staff and journalists have a right to political opinion, both held and publicly expressed. But yeah, as you say on the newsletter, I dived into the emails announcing it to staff, the internal guidance, all kinds of things to try and understand what this means. I'd encourage people to read it. I don't really want to kind of re-go over everything here, Oz, but I just thought maybe it's worth us taking a moment here and just asking, it's a big deal. It's the biggest employer of journalists in the country. Where do we think this leaves us in terms of journalists sharing their opinion? What direction do we think the kind of pendulum on that is swinging? Is it getting looser? Is it a crackdown? Is there threats or challenges to kind of the relationship between journalists and the public from it? What do we reckon? Where are we at with all of that?
Look, this is an issue that I've kind of shifted on recently, largely thanks to you. I think you've done a really good job of kind of convincing me that, particularly at the ABC, and particularly in certain rounds, like, say, political coverage, because the ABC is supposed to be an independent public broadcaster for everyone, it is important for, say, for example, your federal political correspondents to not have any perception of bias, right? Like, I've got their views, they can vote for whoever they want, but I think it does impact the public's ability to take what a federal ABC political reporter is saying at face value if they are posting on social media, I love Anthony Albanese, or I hate Anthony Albanese, or, things to that effect. So I think that's an important principle that the ABC should try to safeguard. But on the question of like where the pendulum has gone, I think for a long time now, and I think unfortunately these rules sort of doubled down on that, they go beyond that. They're really an attempt to try to stop ABC staff from kind of saying anything that could be vaguely controversial. And I think it's important to acknowledge here, when we say controversial, we're talking about what basically the conservatives in this country and the Australian newspaper think is controversial. Like, that's what this is about. And so when you create these rules designed to stop those outlets getting mad at you, what they kind of do is they're kind of just like a red rag, like the Australian now will be like, okay, great. Let's see what things we can dig up on social media accounts. Let's see what group chat screenshots we can find to ping these journalists who might run afoul of these policies. So I don't think this is a great step forward for the freedom of speech of journalists, or just the policing of rules that always tends to be pretty uneven, even though I think there's a merit in there being a broader sense of independence at the ABC.
Yeah, I feel like something that I think we both agree on is that we both sort of believe that you get objective journalism the public can trust by having like a good editorial process. If the process of producing the journalism is like highly rigorous, robust, you take into account different perspectives on a story, you fact check everything, you weigh the evidence, that process should produce things the public can trust. And kind of whether it's the public broadcaster and the board and the chair talking about all these worries about staff bias, or whether it's private companies talking about it, I feel like the focus on it kind of undermines the trust in a way, because it almost tells the public, we don't trust our own processes. We trust like what's in the brains of our journalists, and we want to find out what they believe. That said, I think the thing that I found slightly encouraging in these guidelines, in these new guidelines, was that the old rules talked about the perceived impartiality of journalists. The new ones are perceived ability to do your job. And I think philosophically, I'm not talking legally, just philosophically, that idea of that it's about opinions that could like interrupt your ability to fairly go and get an interview or like fairly do your job, I think that is closer. But the issue, as you say here, Oz, is that in many ways, these new rules, like it reaches into group chats that should be private. It talks about even one-on-one text message chats could, lead you to be disciplined, fired, that kind of thing. And even those like encouraging things that I sort of see like, there's something in that encouraging wording. As long as those are undefined and there's no definition on paper, there's no examples, there's no like transparency. As you say, it feels very likely that we could still see repeats of what happened with Lattouf, where the right-wing media go after someone. When a manager's going to go after people, it's when they feel the heat from those places like the Australian, and it's going to be unevenly applied. And I think just the ABC is a reason to talk about it because it employs the most journalists in this country. But I think across the media, you are still seeing this preoccupation with trying to figure out like what is really inside the minds of journalists. Forget what even they might express, but what the perception could be, reaching in there. And I think there's far too much of that and far too little transparency about management, their decision making, whether it is fair, and we do not have enough eyes on the way managers are exercising this power.
Yeah, you canvassed a lot of that in your very, very good report in the newsletter last week, and reminder that if you want to subscribe to the newsletter to get our breaking news analysis exclusives and to read Scott's breakdown of the ABC's public comment guidelines, you can subscribe at lamestream.com.au. But Scott, today on the show, after nearly 2 years of mass murder in Gaza, Australia has finally expelled an ambassador, but it is not Israel's, it is actually Iran's. On Tuesday, ASIO, Australia's domestic spy agency, sensationally revealed that they had credible evidence linking the Iranian government to multiple anti-Semitic arson attacks in Australia, including the targeting of a synagogue in Melbourne and another fire targeting a kosher deli in Sydney. In response to that news, Australia's government expelled the Iranian ambassador. It's the only such expulsion since World War II. So we're going to dig into what ASIO and the government actually announced, how the media's reacted, and some of the questions that remain outstanding on this really significant and quite dramatic story. Also in today's show, Scott has gone over to the dark side. He's been investigating the intensely pro-Israel media and social media bubbles that millions of people in this country and right around the world really have been stuck in, to try to help us understand why, when despite these huge marches calling on Australia's government to take real action against Israel, so many of our politicians and so many normal Australians seemingly still seem unmoved. And in keeping tabs, we'll discuss the ambush and murder of 2 police officers in regional Victoria by a member of the Fringe Sovereign Citizen movement, a group that we actually discussed last week, and how media coverage of these kinds of incidents differs from other examples of extremist violence.
That is already a lot of big, important news, Oz. Is there more to get to after that?
Believe it or not, there is more, and it's maybe the biggest story of them all. It's the war against Snoop Dogg, something that has really riled you up, Scott, I know.
Well, I'm just baffled by it. I'm just confused by it. And more than anything, I can't wait to get to that, to have you explain to me what is going on down in Melbourne and in AFL world, because I have no idea.
It's a crazy story here. It's nearly 20 years after the rapper was denied a visa in Australia. He's back at the center of a new controversy. After the AFL announced him as the headline Grand Final entertainment, there are now calls for Snoop to be dropped because of his lyrics. What do you and I think about that? Well, you're going to have to stick around to the end to hear us hash it out. All right, Scott, on Tuesday morning, I sent you a text message saying, yo, check out this Iran news. And you said, where? And I said, go to any news website. It is everywhere.
Go to every news website. I did, and it was everywhere. I was buried in a Google Doc, had no idea it was happening until halfway through the press conference.
There was quite an extraordinary press conference that was being held on Tuesday morning outside Parliament House in Canberra. It featured Mike Burgess, the director of ASIO, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke, and Foreign Minister Penny Wong. And in this press conference, Burgess and Albanese announced that ASIO had found evidence that at least 2 high-profile anti-Semitic arson attacks had allegedly been orchestrated by the Iranian government. And as a result, Australia would effectively be severing diplomatic ties with the country, expelling Iran's ambassador from Australia, removing our diplomatic staff from Tehran. It's the first time Australia has taken action of this magnitude since World War II. Iran has denied the allegations. Israel has welcomed them. And in fact, Israel is taking credit for the move, claiming Australia only acted because Netanyahu accused Albanese of being soft on terrorism. We can get into that in a second. This is like quite significant diplomatic news between Australia and Iran, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah. Look, Australia has expelled diplomatic staff before, but usually how this works is, specific staff members who have sort of wrongfully acted on Australian soil, whether it's spying or kind of engaging in all kinds of chicanery, those specific staff get sent away. But it is, as you say, incredibly rare for, an ambassadorial post to be removed, basically cut off diplomatic ties. In 2018, Russian embassy staff were expelled for being involved in intelligence gathering. In 2010, an Israeli diplomat was expelled after misusing Australian passports to help Mossad assassinate a Hamas official in Dubai. But the embassy stayed open, like height of the Cold War, the USSR embassy stayed open. So, the argument is generally that keeping communication open is better, even with kind of adversaries and things. Obviously, this is a huge step to cut off basically the relationship.
Yeah, and we wanted to talk about it because, obviously it's significant geopolitical news for all the reasons you've just described, but also because of kind of what the news means domestically, right? Like for years, and we've been covering this since we started this podcast, so many media outlets in this country, probably most prominently the Australian and the Age, have been trying very hard to link these specific attacks to the pro-Palestine movement. And in fact, multiple governments at federal and state levels in Australia have passed new laws in response to these attacks that have impacted freedom of speech and our right to protest. So there's quite a lot of significance in terms of what this means for the domestic political and media debate in this country. But before we get into that, it's worth discussing just the revelations first. What ASIO shared, what has since come to light, and the questions that I think still remain unanswered at this point in time. Now, according to ASIO, they've linked Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps to 2 separate arson attacks in Australia. One targeting the Lewis Continental Kitchen in Sydney's east in October, and another targeting the anti-semitic Israel synagogue in Melbourne in December. Now, to be very clear, the allegation is not that these attacks were committed by Iranian officials or even anyone of Iranian nationality. Instead, ASIO describes it as a layer cake of cutouts. Essentially, criminal gangs were subcontracted this work by, as ASIO alleges, someone in Iran or Iranian officials or people linked to the Revolutionary Guard Corps. They then further subcontracted it out to other criminals. And ASIO says that there are links between the kind of like high-ranking criminal gang members and the Iranian government. Now, this wouldn't be the first time Iran has operated on Australian soil. In 2022, the Australian government revealed that ASIO had disrupted another operation in Australia. In that time, they were targeting Australian Iranian critics of the regime. Iran then also denied those allegations. But I guess what's different here, Scott, is that the previous allegations of Iranian interference in Australia and in the West largely have to do with Iran monitoring Iranian dissidents in the West, not kind of going after synagogues or delis like they seem to have this time.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about when we are trying to assess like what ASIO has said here, what possible Iranian motivation would be in this, that, you know, in the past, what's been revealed and our understanding of Iranian activities in the West has all been tied to kind of pursuing critics and dissidents. That's been the MO. Back in 2015, an Iranian living in the Netherlands was killed. It came out he'd arrived as a refugee from Iran after being suspected in a bombing for a rebel group against the Iranian regime and was living under a false name. And it's believed the killing of him was an assassination by the Iranians. Just last year, the US charged an Iranian general in absentia and a bunch of other people linked to the regime, allegedly surveilling a dissident and plotting to murder them. So there is a fairly long catalogue, Oz, of Iranian operations in the West, but the focus has always been on the government's internal enemies, dissidents and critics they see as a threat to kind of the regime's narrative.
Right, and I guess that raises some kind of obvious questions at this stage, like, how did Iran do this and why did Iran do this? And those are pretty big questions that we kind of don't really have clear answers to, but we can do our best job at trying to kind of get to the bottom of it here for our listeners. In terms of the how they did this, ASIO hasn't really shared a lot of information, but thanks to previous reporting about these incidents, we actually know a fair bit about who police think was involved on a local Australian frontier. In Melbourne, the synagogue fire has actually been pinned to a specific criminal gang leader, a guy called Kazem Hamad, who is an alleged kingpin in Melbourne's tobacco wars. Now, how exactly he's linked to Iran or how he was cultivated by them or contacted by them or the nature of that relationship is not clear, but he's the person police think is behind the kind of subcontracting of criminals who did end up firebombing that synagogue in Melbourne. In Sydney, it's an entirely different criminal network that's apparently behind the targeting of the kosher deli that was firebombed there. According to court documents that the Sydney Morning Herald obtained, it's a guy called Saeed Musawi who orchestrated that attack. He actually used the pseudonym James Bond on an encrypted messaging network. He told the criminals that he subcontracted he was paid $12,000 to organize this firebombing, and he would give the criminals who did it $4,000. And so, in fact, the people that he subcontracted to, and perhaps this is a message in why you shouldn't, go cheap on your subcontractors, they tried and failed to burn down 2 other venues before eventually targeting the correct kosher deli. But he seemed quite frustrated in the messages that the court has that they didn't do a good enough job. So it sort of is interesting that we have this like kind of clownish attempts to orchestrate these firebombings that ASIO is now saying were actually ultimately puppet mastered by Iran. But again, we don't have any information at this stage as to how Musawi is linked to Iran or figures in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So that's kind of like the how, but there still remain a lot of big questions at this stage.
Yeah, there's heaps. I mean, the first part of it, unpicking this whole kind of criminal gang network and like how involved they are supposed to have been with this plot. New South Wales Police is still briefing the Sydney Morning Herald that they believe that Syed Akar, this wanted drug trafficker who lives in Turkey, who was behind the Dural Caravan hoax, they still think he's behind the majority of attacks in New South Wales. So this is the guy who did that hoax to try and get a deal out of the AFP to be able to return to Australia. So it's unclear if they're saying he's behind the majority, was he somehow has some overlap with these other elements? Does he not? That is all very unclear. Then, like these two cigarette barons that are apparently behind the attack in East Melbourne, the main kind of kingpin that's been named in the press lives in Iraq now, and allegedly kind of his illegal cigarette operation is run out of the Middle East. Presumably, that is where ASIO suspects there's a contact point with the Iranians. Are they alleging that that's a shared contact point? What is going on there? There's lots of questions about that. I suppose to try and make sense of it, Oz, I'd kind of bring it down to like the one question I would throw out there about this plot. And that is that we know that police were not entirely honest in the original incident that a car was linked to. New South Wales Police and the Premier were still publicly saying that was a very real threat when the AFP were in possession of enough information they should have known it wasn't and was a hoax. And we still don't really have any clarity on how the AFP handled a car as a source, if they shielded him in any way. That's all still outstanding. And just like knowing that, so we know that about Dural, I just kind of pose this open question on what we have been told, and that is, how strong is the link between some of these elements in Iran? I don't know anything at all about that, but like I'd say it could very, very well be the case that ASIO found out that this cigarette baron was contacted by someone with links to the Revolutionary Guard Corps and was asked to do that absolutely may be the basis of this. I think the question I'm really interested in is that alone to me may not be enough to fully tell me that Iran is behind these attacks, because even an individual who's in the Revolutionary Guard can act for all kinds of reasons, can do things for all kinds of other self-interested, motivated reasons. And I'd be fascinated as the reporting keeps coming out, if we learn more, if there are interviews, if there are sources, in whether it was kind of established at any point that people actually within the Iranian Guard Corps, the Iranian government, were discussing this as an operation internally. Because that, to me, is the test of whether multiple people were all discussing this, whether this can be established as an Iranian operation.
Yeah, and there are more than 120,000 people in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, including conscripts. Like Iran has national service and you can get conscripted into that. And I think on one hand, it kind of doesn't matter that there's part of this that doesn't matter if it's a member of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, an Iranian national linked to the government who's just decided to go off their own bat and sort of like use their connections with the secret branches. And on one hand, that doesn't really matter if it's that or a government official, because it is very interesting and significant that this stuff was being puppet mastered overseas. But on the other hand, it kind of does matter in terms of like the diplomatic consequences of all this, right? And if the public perception and the media perception is there are Iranian like senior government officials sitting down deciding how to foreign interfere with Australia, like that is significant. Like in that aspect of things, it is interesting if we ever find out like which of those two, or perhaps something in the middle, actually occurred. I'm not totally convinced we'll get to the bottom of it. ASIO doesn't love like sharing all the intimate details of this stuff, but I think there still are like pretty fascinating questions as to how this stuff actually played out, in terms of the minutiae and the detail of it. That's kind of like the how of it so far, Scott. I think there are also a lot of questions as to the why, and there's a lot of people saying like, why would Iran do something like this? I mean, I think we don't know. The Iranian regime is very, bizarre and weird, and has a history of repression and has a history of foreign acts overseas. So there could be like 1,000 different reasons why they chose to do something like this. What we can focus in on are the reasons that have been given by the government and by ASIO, which I think are worth discussing briefly. One reason that the government gave as to why Iran did this was that they are anti-Semitic. Basically, that they just want to attack the Jewish community wherever they are, and they want to harm Australia's social cohesion at the same time. Now, those two reasons to me actually seem like maybe two of the stranger reasons why Iran would sort of do something like this. This is a country that funds Hezbollah and Hamas and very recently engaged in like a ballistic missile war against Israel. Like, I have no doubt that they want to kill Jewish people, but it seems odd that one of the ways they would go about doing that would be burning a synagogue in Melbourne and a deli in Bondi. Like, kind of just like Iran's sheer anti-Semitism as a motive is an unusual thing to throw out there, I think, at this stage when we have so many unanswered questions. In terms of like the undermining of Australia's social cohesion, this is the most fascinating one to me, because if that was the case, it's kind of hard to follow the logic, and it only really stacks up if you accept that basically the entire media establishment and the entire political apparatus in Australia totally fell for Iranian manipulation. Like, that's the only way the argument that Iran was doing this to undermine social cohesion actually makes any kind of sense at all. And let me explain that, right? Like, these arson attacks, what was the immediate reaction to them? They fueled this narrative of rising violent anti-Semitic extremism in Australia, including plenty of articles that attempted to link these attacks to the pro-Palestine movement, right? And to the protest movement more generally. It led to the passing of laws to criminalize elements of the pro-Palestine movement. Now, at that stage, it's hard to see what Iranian strategy that serves, right? Unless you take it to the next level. Maybe what they wanted to do was to stoke that kind of response, so then they would get the backlash, right? The backlash to those new laws, which would lead to greater anti-Israel fervor and intensification of anger at what the Israeli government, what the Australian government are doing. So that could be Iran's like kind of two-step plan here to undermine social cohesion, but it only really makes sense if the government fell for it. And according to the government's own kind of like messaging on this, it seems like that's what happened. Iran allegedly interfered in Australia to undermine social cohesion. The media and the government just assumed or put out there that this wasn't foreign actors or people acting maliciously. This was just Australians being driven mad by violent anti-Semitism, and we have to crack down on it. So it's kind of like a bit of a own goal, I think, from the government, something that hasn't really been pointed out, that if the goal of Iran was to undermine social cohesion, it actually was the media and the government that played right into that. And I think that brings me to my biggest issue with like this whole incident, the situation, the aftermath, the media coverage of what ASIO revealed, leaving aside the specifics of how and why. If Iran is really behind these attacks, where does that leave the argument that's been prosecuted for the last 2 years that Australia's been in the grip of this violent anti-Semitism crisis, and it is a direct result of the pro-Palestine protests? Like, this has been the narrative behind these attacks for so long. In December, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted, in response to that Adass Israel synagogue fire, "It is impossible to separate this reprehensible act from the extreme anti-Israel position of the Labour government." Now, if the attack was orchestrated by Iran and done to undermine social cohesion and then implemented by paid criminals, what does that have to do with the Labour government, whatever its position is, or the bigger question of violent anti-Semitism in Australia? In January this year, Scott, the Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen said, "There have been some in our community who have chosen to use the cover of the conflict to inflict some of the most evil acts we have seen for some time." Again, she was talking about the synagogue fire, and she went on to call out pro-Palestine protesters and said the marches should stop back in January because of how it was fueling the violent anti-Semitism that was leading to incidents like the synagogue fire. I just don't understand how these two things can square, and I don't understand how no one in either the media or in political circles is reckoning with kind of the apparent and quite obvious contradiction here. And it hasn't stopped. Like, those are the examples from earlier in the year or late last year. Literally this week, after the revelations came out about Iran, the SMH's chief political correspondent, James Massola, wrote that the synagogue fire and Iran's involvement in them, quote, highlights how serious the crisis of anti-Semitism has become in Australia. How does it do that? And I want to be very clear here. I'm not denying the existence of anti-Semitism in Australia. I think that would be a ludicrous thing to do. But how can you look at what has been revealed by ASIO and say, actually, this is just more proof that Australia is in the group of a domestic anti-Semitism crisis. If anything, it actually is a sign that, like, oh my God, thank God, sure, there is like anti-Semitism in Australia, as there has been for a long time, and perhaps some of it has been encouraged by, irrational people motivated by what Israel is doing in Gaza. That's a distinct, separate thing. But there is now evidence that, thankfully, it is not just crazy pro-Palestine protesters burning things down. It's Iran paying criminals. But no one seems to want to say that. It's very odd to me, the kind of situation we found ourselves in.
Yeah. I have no doubt that these attacks are anti-Semitic. That is, they're targeting, whether it's a deli or whatever, they are targeting Jews. They are anti-Semitic attacks. But consistently for the last 2 years, as you say, all kinds of commentators, journalists, politicians have used these events in the same breath as the kind of end the war in Gaza movement and use them in the same articles over and over again. The risk of radical politics, creating violence, all this stuff. At this point, how many of these incidents that we've heard so much about are now fully attributable to these criminal elements, whether it's ACAR, whether it's this IRGC kind of network, whatever it is. Now, the vast majority of any kind of arson attack on a Jewish business, any of these things are attributable to people doing it for pay, hired hands. And the attacks are anti-Semitic, but they are by people who are being paid by actors motivated by all kinds of things that have nothing at all to do with the political movement to end the war in Gaza. And the fact that, as you've laid out, so many of the commentators who've been writing this for 2 years are not sort of seeking to apologize, seeking to clarify that distinction, but just going, it proves all along I've been right about this, is a disturbing trend.
Yeah, in a kind of crazy way, these people should be saying it's a good news story. It's I was worried that there were that when I walked through the Melbourne CBD, everyone protesting on Sunday wanted to kill and burn synagogues. Thankfully, we have no evidence of that. And we in fact have significant evidence to the complete contrary. We pass laws in response to this. It's hard to think of a bigger reaction that could have been elicited, right, in terms of the political response. There's legislation passed across various state governments at the federal government level to criminalize certain aspects of speech and protest. And it's just fascinating to me that now we find out that it's allegedly foreign interference and no one wants to go back and think, okay, what does this mean for the country? And what does it mean for the laws that we rush through? I think this is going to be something, Scott, that we should keep an eye on. I'm not convinced that the rest of the media will pick up the kinds of questions that we're asking. But I think more might come to light on this that might put a lot of the coverage over the last couple of years in a pretty different light. All right, after the break, Scott, you're going to break down the misinformation vortex that continues to prop up pro-Israeli sentiment in Australia.
So, Oz, last weekend there was another massive national day of action on Gaza, huge crowds in cities like Brisbane, Melbourne, and again in Sydney. And I think, again, it just shows us that there are pretty massive sections of the community who are just so far ahead on this story compared to what's being discussed in politics and the media. There's just a huge divide opening up between these sections of the community and the media and the politicians supposed to be representing them. And it kind of made me think that for a lot of people now, it is kind of shocking and distressing that there are still people in Australia who support 1000% what the Israeli military are doing in Gaza. And whether that's people they know in their lives or people who are being interviewed on TV, the fact that there's not only kind of supporters, but people who support without any criticism, who just fully believe absolutely everything is right that is going on in Gaza, I thought it would be an interesting moment to talk about why it is those people still exist, and kind of ask the question of why those people retain a pretty outsized voice in Australian media. So I sort of started looking into what people in Australia who believe that are kind of consuming. And I was to flag up front what I'm going to sort of talk about here and a bit of thesis is basically where I got to on it, was that when it comes to people who believe what's happening in Gaza is good and justified, I think we can pretty safely say at this point that it is akin to being in like QAnon. It
Wow.
requires you to exist in such a disinformation bubble, like an alternate universe. It's not far away from like a cult. And whether it's, you know, people kind of deliberately perpetuating that for their own reasons, or who are just kind of like trapped in that bubble, I think like that is what is happening here, and the media should kind of treat it as such. How's that as a thesis up front?
I think it's interesting. This, I mean, immediately just makes me think of a movie I watched this week, Eddington, the latest film by Ari Aster, and it's about kind of like, you know, what 2020 did to a lot of people in terms of COVID and lockdowns. And really interesting interview he gave Sean Fennessy in the Big Picture podcast. And he was talking about how what he thinks is one of the most interesting phenomenons since 2020 is just how people are consuming entirely different forms of media and having entirely different analyses of what's going on in the world. And so when those two people kind of from different media bubbles hit each other, you just get this insane amount of friction. And it feels like what we're talking about now is another example of that.
Yeah, and look, we could dive into pro-Israeli media forever, but I wanted to narrow it. I wanted to look at a specific incident. And this week there was this shocking attack on a hospital in Gaza, in Khan Yunis, which killed 20 people, including healthcare workers and journalists. To explain what actually happened, this was a double tap, it is called, strike. And what that means is this: a cameraman working for Reuters was filming a live stream feed of the Khan Yunis skyline. He had his camera set up on an exterior staircase of the hospital, so the whole world can probably figure out where he is if they watch that vision, and he's marked press. At 10 a.m., a missile hits the exact spot on that staircase, killing him. In the minutes afterwards, rescuers, medical staff, other journalists rush up there to try and treat him, document what has happened, and 10 minutes go by, and Israeli forces hit the exact same spot as this crowd gathers around him. All of this is filmed. It is a disturbing watch, so I won't play any of it, but if people are interested, they're more than welcome to seek that out. Now, double tap strikes are actually like a classic terrorist tactic to maximize terrorist casualties, and it's why after a terror attack, medics and rescuers don't immediately go in, because this is
ISIS does this quite a lot. ISIS did this quite a lot.
Exactly. Now, Netanyahu did a press conference this week calling it a tragic accident and promising an investigation. But back in July, the independent Israeli-Palestinian magazine 972 published an investigation with numerous Palestinian witnesses and sources inside the IDF, admitting this was a deliberate tactic that was used by the Israeli military, knowingly killing rescue workers who arrive on the scene. To clarify, that if that evidence held up in a court, that is a straight-up war crime. Even if the person those rescuers are helping is an armed combatant, it's a war crime. Let alone, in this case, when the person that has been struck and they're seeking to aid is an unarmed journalist. Now, that I've explained what happened, how would someone in this pro-Israeli propaganda bubble have heard this news? Any conversation about this sort of has to start with Israel's Channel 14, which is the most right-wing news channel in Israel. It's the second most popular. And it reaches Australians here with clips that are posted on social media, liked by Australians. Here's a little clip on this story. It is in Hebrew, and I'll explain what he's saying in a second, but I just wanted to play it for the backing music alone of the tone of this kind of media.
תצפיתן שהפעיל מצלמה. יש בתוכנו כאלה אבל שמהירו להגיב שזאת תגובה קיצונית ביחס לתצפיתן שמפעיל מצלמה.
Oz, that backing music, it makes me feel like I'm listening to like the Israeli equivalent of Kyle Sanderlands, not a report on like the killing of journalists and medical workers. It's a crazy channel, and
it's almost like celebratory.
Yeah, it is like commercial radio. And to tell you what he was saying, he was telling viewers at the top of the show that the only reason this was a controversy was because somebody was filming the strike as it happened, saying that the person who was holding the camera was a spotter for Hamas, was likely a spotter for Hamas, responsible for the killing of Israeli soldiers, and blamed people who filmed these things for the controversy, and then goes on to say that Netanyahu should have never apologized, never have called it tragic, and that these rescuers and internationally accredited journalists are terrorists, and that Israel should not apologize for killing them.
And that's the second most popular news network in Israel.
Yeah. And that is being said to that backing track. Like, it is shocking. Now, the claims these kind of propaganda, right-wing propaganda networks have are then often repackaged in English for international audiences. There's a publication called Israel Hayom, which is based in Israel, but has covered Australia extensively. They do a bunch of stories on Albanese, a bunch of stories on what's happening here with the protest movement. And it's followed by Australians. And you can imagine with all those stories on Australia, it's amassed a decent audience here. So in its report, in English, it doesn't even say that the first strike killed a cameraman working for Reuters. In fact, it doesn't even acknowledge that the military targeted a human being in that strike. It says the IDF, quote, struck a, quote, a camera tracking its troops.
Wow.
Was there a human attached to that camera? Who knows if you read that source of information? To follow the chain a little bit further, that's maybe the world that someone here is existing in if they're plugged into Israeli sources. Follow it a bit further, it gets into the Australian mainstream media through kind of centrist, quote-unquote, spokespeople who Australian journalists believe are kind of sensible and reasonable. They go to them for comment. One of them, Alon Levy, people might be familiar with. He's former spokesperson for Netanyahu, who's kind of turned independent influencer / propagandist. And he's been on the ABC, he's been on a bunch of different networks. And he said in reaction to this story, you know, it's a tragic accident and that Israel's war is with terrorists, not journalists and rescuers. So a journalist here booking him might go, oh, seems very reasonable. Let's get him on to present the kind of official line. But Oz, listen to this clip of him just after the strike on Sky News Australia with Shari Markson, and notice the baseless claim that was in that Israeli right-wing media that he repeats, even though he is a, you know, sensible Israeli spokesperson, quote unquote.
We know that there has been at Nasser Hospital, in particular, claims that Hamas had put a camera on the roof of that hospital that was spying on soldiers' movement and putting their movements and putting those soldiers at risk. But I trust the IDF will investigate that incident.
Yeah, wow. So that's just been like fully laundered into the Australian media landscape.
Totally. And then in an amazing example, Oz, of life imitating art, the Israeli military conducted their promised investigation in a space of about 24 hours. And guess what they found? The official investigation after these two bits of media I've just played finds that this baseless claim is what happened, that there was an unmanned Hamas spy camera. Forget that the missile strikes exactly where this Reuters cameraman is standing. Exactly. The IDF was actually targeting an unmanned Hamas spy camera. And, like, if you are within this bubble, you will hear all of that without any of the context I laid out up top about double tap strikes, what happens in the actual vision. All you hear are these baseless claims, then backed up by an official investigation that gave no evidence to journalists. And not only are the people in the bubble affected by that, but then because it is then kind of re-plugged into the official line of Israel, that line is now in all of the news coverage, quoted as kind of balance. And it is just a stunning example to me of the different information bubble people are living in, and then how that affects all of us and mainstream journalism.
It's really interesting context in terms of the conversations we've had over the last few weeks about like the quote unquote shift in the Australian media, in the Australian population. Like, I think the huge numbers of people we've seen at protests kind of week after week now suggest that, this kind of the heinous nature of the crimes being committed by Israel are starting to reach a bigger section of the community. But I've got people in my life, I'm sure you do as well. You have conversations with them and they'll say, oh, this girl I went to school with or this guy I work with, like he just doesn't accept what I'm saying, I still see him post stuff on social media that suggests that everyone Israel's killing is a terrorist and so they're a valid target. And so I think this kind of investigation by you, the way you break it down, people who think like that, they're not watching even like Matt Doran and the ABC make their small shifts. They're not even reading the editorials in the SMH, make their tiny shifts. They're certainly not listening to Lamestream, break it down. They're consuming exactly what you've laid out. And they're kind of just like cooking in that little ecosystem. And they're probably being more reassured that they're more right and that everyone else is lying to them. That seems to be the dynamic that exists at this point in time.
Yeah, and like it just made me think going into this, I mean, there's countless examples. We could spend so long going down this and talk about all the ways this ecosystem works. But looking at this one, it just made me think like, at what point do journalists begin treating this world as kind of like a QAnon? You wouldn't put somebody that far removed from facts on like live to air, for example. You would probably only ever interview a kind of QAnon cooker in an environment where you could edit them, where you could make sure that they weren't spreading any of these things. And I mean, like, at what point do we reach that? And I don't have the answer for that. I think this is a very complicated situation, but I just thought I'd mention that I watched 7:30's Sarah Ferguson had an Israeli minister on this week, and I actually think she was really strong in that interview. Like, she was very robust when asking him about the starvation of children in Gaza. He began to claim Israel was letting in aid, and she interjected several times to say, like, it is a fact, Israel is letting in less than the amount of food to sustain human life, and was very robust. But also, at the same time, he said so many things that were just not true, like mistranslations of Hamas statements. Hamas is stealing all of the aid. All fit so much in that, and I'm not saying that interview like should not be conducted or anything, but I just think it's like an interesting question to ponder of like, when does it serve a journalistic purpose to have these people on air? Like, is the media doing a good job of when we choose to give these people airtime? If this is the level of removal, does it serve a journalistic purpose anymore?
I'm so glad you asked me this question, Scott. And I'm conscious of the fact that you and I might have slightly different views on this. I mean, I've certainly been on the record in terms of Sarah Ferguson and her decisions on who to sit down with and give interviews to. I've kind of got two problems with this kind of approach at this point in time, right? One of them is it never happens to the other side, right? And by that I mean, like, the ABC, particularly on flagship programs like 7:30, barely ever features anyone who is like pro-Palestinian, let alone anyone who would be saying the equivalent things that sort of these kind of deranged Israeli ministers are saying, right? They just don't do that. I mean, the ABC doesn't even have you and I on any of its programs to talk about anything, let alone actual Palestinians or people in Gaza rebutting the kind of stuff that they have Israeli ministers on saying. That's like my one problem with it. My second problem with it is they're running a playbook that I just don't think makes any sense anymore. Like, I think, and this is partly the generational problem with the ABC and kind of where so many of its leaders and its senior journalists are kind of still stuck in. They think it's still the 90s or even the 2000s where you get that figure on TV, you hoist them on their own petard, you give them enough rope, you expose them, 2 million people watch that interview, that ruins that person's career. Australia wakes up the next day and says, yes, thank you so much, ABC, for holding that person to account. Onwards we go, liberal democracy wins out, blah, 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 blah. That's just not how it works anymore. Like there may be the small number of people who are genuinely curious watching the show and seeing Sarah Ferguson bring on a crazy person and deconstruct their arguments. That might change their view. But largely, like, what the Israeli government and its propagandists are doing is just flooding the airwaves, trying to pump out their information through every single channel they can, clipping themselves up on respectable news channels, editing it so it looks good, pushing that out through Telegram and X and Instagram and Facebook and Blue Sky and everything, and just trying to dominate the conversation that way. I think that these journalists at this point in time are more being used than they are actually doing anything useful in rebutting the kind of claims that are being put to air. That's kind of my take on it. I'm very, very open to you having a more sensible, nuanced perspective if you do.
Like, honestly, I just think it's a really interesting question. I don't think I have an answer. Like, on the one hand, I've seen some Palestinians get this kind of time. I've seen Mustafa Barghouti get featured on ABC TV a couple of times. I think your point about weight is important. I think, because I do believe that there's still a place for kind of a combative interview to be worthwhile. But I think that what you say about like flooding of the media, when Israeli spokespeople get so many more appearances than those rare appearances by Mustafa Barghouti, when they get so much airtime, they are much more interested in the flood and volume than if they get tripped up on a question or two, and they are much more interested in kind of pure propaganda, pure disinformation, like demonstrable untruths and getting those out there, than the risk of, looking like they're babbling for kind of 2 seconds within that interview. They won't clip that bit. And I do think there is something that needs to be considered in that. And there needs to be some understanding of, I guess, just a self-interrogation of when is this worthwhile journalistically and when it's not. I don't really have my line on it, Oz. I don't know when it is. But I think it's safe to say that it hasn't been the right line generally.
Can I say something
media?
Provocative? And I'm not trying to do a gotcha on you here at all. I think this is more a question for the people who program this stuff.
Please.
And I know that sometimes we maybe overuse the kind of Russia comparison, but I think in this instance, it's valid. Like, there has definitely been the odd occasion in which the ABC has gotten a extremely pro-Putin, slightly deranged Russian figure on and skewered them. But the ABC very clearly has decided, like most news organizations in Australia, quite rightly, that regularly bringing on crazy members of Vladimir Putin's cabinet to just spout QAnon-esque nonsense about what they're doing in Ukraine has no news merit, amplifies propaganda, and is not worth skewering, right? They've made that decision. That same logic applies to what they do with Israel. The only reason they don't do it for Israel is not because of a genuine desire to report news accurately. It's because they have been under sustained lobbying and pressure from powerful pro-Israeli figures. That's the only difference. So I think when you kind of look at those things side by side, you kind of get the answer clarified a little bit, at least for me, in terms of what should happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with it. I think that there's definitely, and it's why I picked an interesting example where it is quite robust. Because I could talk about Sharry Markson having all these people on to spout nonsense till the cows come home. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me where I don't know where the line is in one that is robust. I do think there is something inherent about the volume, even when they're being treated robustly, the pure amount of hours and minutes that they're in people's feeds and on TV, and that is beneficial to them in a way that journalists don't want to admit. But I don't know where the line is exactly.
No, that is totally fair. That is totally fair. And I think again, you've done a very good job of just breaking down the kind of cycle that this stuff kind of moves through, the vortex that I called it. So thank you for probably doing something that left you feeling a bit gross and icky. I hope you were able to have a shower and recover mentally after diving into Channel
Thank
14.
you for, bringing me out of the vortex with some hard opinions, some hard questions. It was good. It's brought me back to life.
Well, we're gonna change gears after the break, well and truly to a different topic. Coming up, we get into the great Snoop Dogg debate. Scott, there's one other story I just wanted to touch on quickly, mainly because it's still a developing story and things can change very fast, and there's no point getting really deep into it, as this is constantly evolving. On Tuesday, 2 police officers were killed and another was injured in an ambush in a property in rural Victoria. And as we're recording, there is still a manhunt underway for the alleged shooter, a guy called Desi Freeman, who's also known as Desmond Philby. Now, Freeman is a sovereign citizen. That's something that we discussed last week. We mentioned Mahmoud Fazal's Four Corners episode, and we talked about how that was a pretty interesting and really good example of reporting on extremism And I'd encourage everyone who wants to know more about what the sovereign citizen movement is to kind of check that episode out. It's quite extraordinary, the timing of it, in terms of this sort of police ambush and this quite horrific incident that's occurred. Now, a couple of things to say, like the sovereign citizen movement, I say the word movement, they're not an organized group. Like there's no direct links between a lot of the people involved in it. They subscribe to these broad ideas that the government is illegitimate, the police are illegitimate, and a lot of it really coalesced around COVID and pandemic lockdown laws and that kind of a thing. All I really wanted to say about this story at this point in time is that this is now the second shooting in 2 years targeting 2 different police officers. So 4 police officers have now been killed in the space of a couple of years at the hands of sovereign citizens. It doesn't really seem to me that the political and media kind of conversation has really caught up to the fact that this is a very violent, very extreme, either like group, movement, or set of individuals impacted by this movement. And I just say that you lived through this as I did, Scott. We're still kind of living through this. If like someone accused of Islamic terrorism had killed 1 police officer, let alone 2 distinct like groups of people killing 2 police officers twice over the space of 2 years, I feel like this would be like the biggest story every single day until new laws were passed, until new military units were formed, until more and more people were being arrested without charge and detained. And I don't think that is the way to resolve the sovereign citizen movement. It is just a really interesting real-time case study to me in terms of how one set of extremists are treated compared to another. And even now, like police have admitted they had a file on this guy. We don't know whether or not like ASIO could have played a role in being more proactive. I mean, ASIO has warned about the rise of far-right extremism, but I'm very curious as to like where it fits in the priorities. It's certainly not a political priority. In fact, we've had governments and particularly politicians on the liberal and national side just basically say that far-right extremism doesn't exist. We just got to worry about Islamic extremism and kind of pro-Palestine extremism. A lot of the coverage so far is that classic kind of like, he was such a great guy who just went down a rabbit hole during COVID. Again, that could all be true. And in fact, I'd argue that nuanced, interesting, intelligent coverage that tries to understand what drives people to do stuff like this is really valid and really valuable. But I mean, no one's even using the word terrorism. This is the execution and ambush of 2 police officers. It's a pretty interesting case study to me in terms of how people, because of their beliefs and their background, get treated versus others. It's kind of all I really wanted to say on this story. And we might have more to say as more comes to light, but that's just my like 2 cents at this point in time.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. It's fascinating. There's all kinds of interesting stuff about why police and different security services kind of downplay mental health when it comes to Islamic terrorism, and all kinds of interesting things there, and why the media don't often talk about it. So it's a fascinating topic that I think we should keep an eye on, Oz, because there's going to be far more happening in that case.
Scott, take us to the topic that everyone wants us to talk about this week.
So gladly. I have to talk to you about this Snoop Dogg Grand Final thing. I've been hanging out all week. I feel like I want to talk to you about it because A, you're like a far better cultural critic than me, and B, you know more about the AFL, which I only have like a working knowledge of. But I have just been bewildered, Oz, by this story of how Snoop Dogg should be like barred from either Australia, or just like the AFL should cancel his booking for his performance at the Grand Final, which is scheduled. And even stranger to me than that even being a story is that it's built and built and built. Like, this story has been going for like 2 weeks and it seems to be getting more and more prominent, not less and less.
Bigger and bigger. Totally.
Prominent. And like, I became aware of it through this opinion piece that got run in the Murdoch-owned Adelaide Advertiser. And just this quote, I saw this and became aware of this even being a furor. A rapper? He may as well sing in another language. In fact, he should sing in another language, given the vulgar, antisocial, sexist content of his music. Like, it's like the embarrassing cringe of like seeing Australian tabloid journalism interact with American hip hop. Like, that makes I get a visceral reaction from that. But then Oz, weirder is, okay, I could see that being a beat up from the tabloid media for a few weeks. Weirdly, it's also brought in sort of progressives behind it. And, you know, Respect Victoria, an anti-domestic violence group, has been advocating against the AFL having him. And then this week, an Australian senator joins in. Is it Bob Katter? Is it who's saying that Snoop Dogg needs to get off our turf? No, it's your old mates, the Australian Greens, and Sarah Hanson-Young. Here is her on Tuesday.
The irony is not lost on many of us that while Isaac Rankin gets dumped, Snoop Dogg gets $2 million to play his misogynistic, homophobic music on our turf.
On our turf, Oz. On our turf.
Firstly,
what do we
calling
think of that?
Sarah Hanson-Young one of my old mates is very funny and a very niche troll that like 6 people will get. So I respect that. But that, I mean, that's extraordinary that this scandal has made it to Parliament. That's incredible. I guess because like you got parliamentary privilege and maybe Snoop Dogg would sue for defamation if Sarah Hanson-Young said that out of Parliament. I don't know. But quite an extraordinary intervention from a federal senator into the choice of AFL Grand Final entertainment.
Yeah. I mean, and using stuff like on our turf, I don't know who is like maybe a Greens voter who's like, yes, keep Snoop Dogg off our sacred turf. It's bizarre. Like, and I understand that there's some tricky territory here, Oz, as we turn to like what I guess we actually make of this rather than just how crazy the coverage is. But to me, like, even though it seems tricky, it does seem so obvious to me, which is that only Australia would do this, apply this test to a kind of American black rapper. And, you know, I'm not going to claim I'm an expert on all the nuance here, but when we are dragging up lyrics from 10, 15, 20 years ago, when Snoop says himself that he's like against violence against women, against homophobia, he says that now. To drag up these lyrics, I feel like the rest of the world, particularly the US, understands that this is an art form, hip-hop, that came out of deprived communities that had violence perpetrated against them and within them, and that as a kid growing up in that, like, your music is not going to be squeaky clean like you went to a liberal arts degree, and that making past lyrics the test, not even current values, sort of bars this art form from like the mainstream. And it seems incredibly racist to me. And we would never make this application to white artists. Like, I have not heard the Rolling Stones disavow like relationships with minors and 13 and 14-year-old girls. You don't see calls for that in the Senate or in newspapers when they tour. Like, there is legitimate stuff here, Oz, of, you know, I think probably it's, you can tell me, but like these issues of homophobia and sexism are probably not recognized enough within hip-hop culture still today. There are very smart black women who've written incredible essays about this and gone into it and been very strong on it and staunch on it. And there is a debate to be had. I don't know whether like visa bans or like barring hip-hop artists from sporting events is the answer to any of it, and seems just very embarrassing little nationalist Australia.
I think, Scott, I think you're right to identify this with the lens that you have. Like this is a lot of things, this story, and I'm happy to step through them bit by bit briefly. But I think at its top layer is another example of Australia's long history of policing hip-hop and rap artists in particular. I mentioned at the top of the show, 20 years ago, Snoop Dogg was denied a visa, right? Because of concern around his criminal record and that his lyrics might, you know, fail the character test and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Australia has banned lots of rappers. Australia polices rappers in its own country. You know, go check out the Netflix documentary on 1-4. I've talked about this for years.
Does anyone feature in that? Is there anyone that people can look out for?
I've talked about this for years. Lots of people have written about this for years. Australia, more than almost any other country except maybe the UK, at this point in time, is deploying extraordinary like police and policy measures to suppress certain rappers because of the lyrics that they use in their songs. the kind of issue around Snoop Dogg, like to me, it is, if not entirely, at least partly an extension of that same thing. And I think you brought up the comparison with the Rolling Stones. Let me give you another comparison, right? Last year, Katy Perry performed at the AFL Grand Final. The year before that, Kiss performed. I encourage you to look at the Wikipedia page of Gene Simmons from Kiss. The controversy section is longer than Snoop Dogg's controversy section. He has been accused credibly of sexual assault multiple times, right? Did any of this feature at all in the conversation around Kiss performing at the AFL Grand Final? Not at all. Like, there is absolutely an element of like racism at play here, an element of ingrained like hip-hopophobia from like, you know, white establishment figures. And I think that includes Sarah Hanson-Young in this instance. The fact that she's chosen to go so hard on this person. All of this, like none of this is an excuse for like having homophobic or misogynistic lyrics or saying dumb things on podcasts, right? That's not the point. But it's an unusual standard that is being brought to bear. I think the other part of this that has made it a bigger story is the AFL is like weirdly in the midst of like a homophobia crisis. Like there've been multiple high-profile players.
To me. I don't really understand what's going on.
There've been multiple high-profile players pinged for using homophobic slurs on the field. And, you know, Sarah Singer made reference to this. Isaac Rankin, who's a very significant player for the Adelaide Crows, who, you know, a good grand final chance. He was accused of, you know, using the F word on the field. And so there's this like kind of ridiculous and I think bad faith debate that's played out in the AFL media that like, well, how can the AFL crack down on Isaac Rankin when they're also bringing Snoop Dogg in and he's got a history of homophobia? I just don't even think the two things exist in any kind of comparable world here. The AFL, like the AFL's issues with homophobia are significant and it needs to deal with them. There are clearly issues in the AFL on this issue. I think what is unfortunately like this is building towards, Scott, I kind of wouldn't be surprised if Snoop Dogg like ends up being cancelled or is like encouraged to withdraw. And I think the AFL, I think, might want to send some sort of statement. There's this like weird line going around at the moment that they're worried that there's going to be 100,000 people booing Snoop Dogg because of his homophobia. I mean, firstly, when did Australia like become the moral, like the moral compass on how to treat marginalized people? They did 100,000 like Collingwood and Adelaide Crows fans who are pissed off about Isaac Rankin are going to be like, boo Snoop Dogg. We're really woke. We love diversity. We love marginalized people. We love the queer community. Get out of our country. It's this insane fantasy land people have created about AFL fans. It's a ridiculous situation. The only point that I think is worth making about Snoop, and Sarah Hanson-Young did get to this, I would just love the AFL to spend that much money and give that kind of slot to an Australian act. Like Australian music is in crisis right now. Give it to an Australian hip hop act, you know? If you want to say you support hip hop and you don't want to do Snoop Dogg, fine, whatever. It's an annoying situation we've ended up in. But like, you could give an Australian artist a huge platform in front of millions of people at a time when the industry really needs it. That is every single thought I've got on the Snoop Dogg controversy, Scott.
I learned a lot. I'm so glad I did. I feel like know more than me about this. I feel like it's surprising to me that the AFL are even being treated like that. The public or journalists are even treating them like they have some values on this that they're not living up to. It's like
exactly
the AFL is a business that probably only passed these rules to begin with to kind of help attract corporate advertisers who don't want to be associated with homophobia. The second that it becomes more valuable to have a star player in the grand final play, those rules are curtailed. And actually, we're not going to follow those rules to the letter. We want him to play in the grand final. And
I mean, that's exactly what happened with the ranking thing. Like everyone else gets 5 weeks, he gets 4 weeks. So like it is bullshit, and it is double standards from basically everyone.
Yeah. And then with Snoop, while it's making the money for him to stay booked, they'll keep him booked. When it turns into a PR crisis with advertisers, they'll unbook him. It is a pure kind of business transaction. The idea that there are any real values going on in this debate seems bizarre to me. But just like while we're on, I guess, homophobia in the AFL and stuff, it is worth probably acknowledging the news that former West Coast Eagle player Mitch Brown came out as bisexual yesterday, which makes him the first, even former AFL player to come out, which is incredible. It is like a big moment for the code, it is also a great opportunity for me to remind our Melbourne listeners that the great sport of rugby league had an out, gay, proud player in the rugby league 30 years ago. Has there been one since, Oz? No, there hasn't. It's been terrible, but I will cling to that rugby league was having this conversation 30 years ago. Did it end well? No, but it was had, and that's a skerrick that we have on the AFL.
I mean, yeah, chalk that up to another point in the internal battle of which code is woker, NRL or AFL. Melbourne people lose their minds at this. Melbourne people are convinced that NRL is just like, complete lunatics who don't believe in anything, just doing terrible things to one another. Let me tell you, the AFL is full of homophobic private schoolboys, and the NRL is the only code in Australia where a majority of the players are not white. So that's 2 points in NRL's
That's 2
favour.
points. And the great Ian Roberts, what a legend. You can look into him if you haven't heard of him. Check him out on
And just
YouTube.
no one look up any recent NRL news that may involve the South Sydney Rabbitohs or the Sydney Roosters. Just stay clear of those headlines.
Clear. Those are our 2 teams. They're fine. They're fine.
That's it from us. Thank you, Scott. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. And remember to subscribe to our newsletter. It's the best way you can support us at lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer, Izzy Lewis. Thank you to our producer, Bez. Scott, see you next week.
See you next week, Oz.